All right, hello and welcome back to Truth and Liberty. This is your host, Mike Lewis. Thanks for tuning in. I'm enjoying doing this. I hope you're enjoying listening. So I do thank you. Please do like and subscribe and share with your friends and everything. I really would love to get some more feedback if I can from people. If there's any topics you want me to cover, any questions you want me to answer, I can do episodes on them, or maybe you have an objection to something I've said, or an objection to something, or an objection you've heard to the kinds of things I'm saying that you want an answer to. By all means, send them my way. I'll talk about them. So today I'm continuing my trek through Romans 13. This will be, I think, the third installment in this series. So far I've talked about a couple different concepts already, being that, first of all, that our analysis of these things are looking at this and coming up with this theory from Romans 13, our theory of government, that any sort of statement that we would say about whether a government is just or an unjust is not really a denial of our duty to submit to a government, our duty to pay taxes or anything like that. We've talked a little bit about what that means. I've also I've begun last week starting to look into the parallels between Romans 13 and Ephesians 6, and talking about the fact that the authority, the government, the magistrate, whoever this governing authority is also someone who is under authority. Like I looked at the bondservant and the master in Ephesians 6, and said, that master, he has a master too, and he's on even playing field with his subjects when he stands before God. And the same can be said of the magistrate. The magistrate's really on an even playing field with his people as far as a status. So there's a strain of statism. It hasn't really quite been out there in the last couple hundred years, so I don't really hear people saying this all that much, but it's the divine right of kings type of thought, that kings somehow have this higher moral status or this different moral status than their subjects, and that is invalid. We would not hold to that. We would say ultimately the magistrate has a role to play in society, and in order for him to fulfill the role, people need to be underneath his authority for whatever that means, and we'll talk about what that means. But that does not mean that he has this higher moral status or this different standard to live by. Doesn't mean that he has moral permission to break a moral law of God that would apply to everybody else. And so that's an important thing to consider. So today I want to kind of dive back into this parallel here, though, because I sort of brushed by it. We are looking at verses 3 and 4 of Romans 13, and we're comparing that with, we're actually really comparing the first 4 verses of Romans 13 with the first 4 verses of Ephesians 6. Ephesians 6 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." So we looked at Romans 13, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." All right, so there's a parallel here, right? You've got children being told to obey their parents. You've got citizens being told to submit to governing authorities. You have a reason given in Ephesians 6. A reason given. In Ephesians 6, it's tied to the commandment, the fifth commandment. Sorry, my numbering went off there in my mind for a second. It's tied to the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. And there's a promise there that it may go well with you and you may live long in life in the land. The purpose in that particular context, Exodus 20, that command, the living long life in the land specifically there in that was in mind was the land of Canaan, that the Israelites were going on their way. At this point, they had just left Egypt. They were at Mount Sinai. They received the law, and they were going to go from there up to the land of Canaan. Of course, we know from history they ended up at with the 10 spies that were bad, and God had to punish them by sending them through the wilderness for an extra 40 years till that whole generation died off, and then eventually they went into the land. But they were still, God's purpose and plan for them at this point. They were on their way to the land. And so that land, that living long life in the land, the purpose of honoring your father and mother was that father and mother, Deuteronomy 6 talks about father and mother are there to instruct children in the ways of the Lord so that then they can honor the Lord, because as you see in the Old Covenant law, there's Deuteronomy especially, there's this heavy level of warning in there where God is saying, listen, don't turn away from following me. If you get in the land and you get comfortable and you start running, living for yourself, or thinking that you made all this stuff. It talks about how, when you get into land and you live in cities you didn't build and houses you didn't build and you eat from orchards you didn't plant, etc., etc. It says, don't forget the Lord, because the Lord is the one who brought you in here. The temptation would be in future generations, people would drift away from remembering the Lord. And so God had prescribed that parents should teach their children the ways of the Lord. And children need to honor their father and mother. If they don't honor their father and mother, they're not going to learn these things. They're not going to learn God's law, and their hearts are going to go astray. Of course, studying the history of Israel, you just got to look at the judges, and unfortunately, by God's sovereignty, but also sort of unfortunately for those people, they did go astray, and there had to be periods of discipline, but that's a major history to get into, and obviously the purpose of all of that was to point forward to the fact that we need the ultimate Savior in Christ, that the law is not our Savior, that really we can't be right with God through the law because we're too sinful, and we can do our best to try to teach our kids, and they may still go astray. Who knows? Anyway, all that to say, there's a reasoning giving there, right? Children are to honor their father and mother that they may learn the ways of the Lord. Here in Romans 13, the reason given is that their authority comes from God, right? God has instituted the government. And so, it says whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. So if we resist the authority, we are resisting God's appointment. And I think in that there's a double meaning. There's the decorative and the perceptive there. There's the God has set this authority up, and he's there bearing the sword. And if you get in his way, he's gonna use the sword on you. So in a sense, there's a little bit of a wisdom idea there. And this guy, whether he's using the sword rightly or not, he's using the sword. And if you get in his way, he's going to use the sword on you. So stay out of his way. I think that's one valid perspective on it. But I think another perspective is if you're not submitting to proper authority, then you are due to receive wrath and judgment. I still need to talk about what that authority is, though, right? So then later on it says to avoid wrath, we must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So again, that's the double thing there, right? So there's the sake of conscience would be, so we don't have to worry about whether or not we're living rightly. So we don't have to have this conflict of conscience. I broke the law, so does that mean I have to go to jail now, or whatever? So you don't have this conflict of conscience. But also, it says not only for God's wrath, which means God's wrath is in play here, right? So again, we have a little more of that idea that as a Christian, our duty is to obey government, and or at least to default to that position, right? At least to have that perspective that says, okay, we are to submit to our governing authorities because God is the one who's put them there. They are there. They are over us. They have authority over us that God has given them, even in a state, especially in a state, right? This would be especially more directly understandable in a state, although it still applies to a market system, which I'll talk about. But in a state government especially, they are an authority over you. They're going to tell you what to do. The classic. There's always that exception given. They don't have the authority to command you to violate God's law, etc. Right? So, the example would be from Acts, where the authorities there, they try to tell Peter to stop preaching the gospel, and he says, "Well, now you've put us in a position where we have to obey God or we have to obey man, and so, you let us know which one we're supposed to do." Sort of kind of a sarcastic non-answer there, with an implied answer, because he's like, you know what, I'm going to obey God. So in a situation where we have to choose between obeying God and obeying man, we have to obey God, right? But unless there's a direct conflict there, we have to default to obeying earthly authority as a duty, for us. But again, the other concept we've talked about, though, in previous episodes, is that this duty on our behalf is not the same thing as a permission on their behalf to do just whatever, right? We can still evaluate whether their authority is just. We can still evaluate whether they are behaving justly and they're fulfilling their God prescribed role properly and correctly, even given whether, even if we submit, we can still submit and obey, but still understand whether they are going off the rails or not. And so let's get into that a little bit, because this next verse, in verse 4, and then in verses 3 and 4 in Romans 13, really starts to unpack that. So verse 4 in Ephesians 6 says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Right? Verses 3 and 4 in Romans 13, "Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." Okay, so here's the parallel. There's actually there's a couplet in each section. All right, each section has a do and a do not. Right? Now, again, in Ephesians 6, he's directly addressing fathers. He's not directly addressing magistrates in Romans 13. And I take that to mean there weren't any in the church there. I'm certain that if there were some in the church there, he would have directly addressed them, because that's his pattern elsewhere. But at this point, I don't know of any evidence that there was any magistrates. Obviously, Caesar was a pagan who did not believe in God's word, and as we can see, in just 10 years, he would start attacking Christians. So he's not directly addressing the magistrate, but there's still the same ideas there, right? There's still that do and do not there, right? In Ephesians 6, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but do bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. In Romans 13, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. That's the do. The do not is, do not terrorize good conduct. What are you to do? You're to be an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer, right? So there's that do and that do not, right? So my point in bringing up the parallelism here is, even though Romans 13 does not directly address the magistrate, there is a precept here that we can use to understand whether or not a magistrate is just or not. And we can evaluate this, and we can say, this magistrate, this governing authority, is not operating the way God wants them to operate. And so we can come to a conclusion as far as that. Now, again, what do we do with that? That's a different question. What do we do with that evaluation? That's a different question. We can say this magistrate is or is not justly using his authority. And based on this analysis, we can determine whether power has been abused or not. So what is this analysis? What is the do and do not here? So you have a dualism here, right? There's an either or. Because of the nature of the do, and because of the nature of the authority that the magistrate has, really anything that the magistrate does that is not in the do category is in the do not category. Right? The do not category is terrorizing good conduct. The do not category the do category is bear the sword against the wrongdoer. Right? Now we would understand the definition of magistrate is bearing the sword. It says here in verse 4, he does not bear the sword in vain. The governing authority is a sword bearer. That's what governments do. They use coercion. They use threats or actual violence to accomplish their purposes. And in a sense, that's supposed to be the way it is. That is the defining characteristic of a governing authority, is that they use the sword to punish people in society who are doing wrong. That's what it says right here. He is God's servant, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. That's the definition of a governing authority. And when you look at it, anything the government does involves the sword. What makes a government different than any other kind of organization is that they use coercion. They specifically do not use voluntary cooperation. Right? So you have, let's say you have like something like welfare, right? You've got people who are sick, who are maybe old, they don't have enough money to pay for themselves. Or I just read an article about how Hurricane Irma completely devastated the island of Barbuda after its in its wake or whatever. Like something like 95% of the buildings were completely demolished. I think there were like 1,800 people who lived on the island who had to evacuate and now have literally no homes to go back to. It's a tragic thing. It's a tragic thing, and we can pray for those people, absolutely, and we can give charitable donations to organizations who are helping them, and I think we should. I read another article in the wake of Irma about how Christians are outpacing FEMA in support and aid to Florida. That's great. I think that's great because I think that's what the church should be doing. It's not the primary thing the church should be doing. Obviously, the gospel is the primary thing, and I really hope that those people taking that aid down there, they took the gospel with them, right? That this was not just something they were doing, that this was a tool for the gospel. And you have to beg the question. I mean, it was a secular news reporting outlet who was reporting this, so what is their definition of Christian? So it's not quite as great news as you would hope, but point being though, let's say you have something like Irma happen, and there needs to be some extra funds brought in to help that place in that island country of Barbuda rebuild itself, because they have I think they said they had a GDP of like $1 billion a year, and they they can't produce enough to rebuild themselves, especially not with all of their capital goods destroyed by this hurricane. It's a devastating situation. So what do? Do we steal from rich people in another part of the world to pay for that, or do rich people in another part of the world voluntarily give to help them rebuild? And many people would say, well, we have to steal because the rich people aren't going to give voluntarily. And whether or not that's true, that's a pragmatic argument. That is not valid reasoning, right? Pragmatism does not trump principle, and the principle is still that stealing is not is a sin. Thou shalt not steal, and so it would be wrong to take from those people, force them to give to this country. But you have two different ways, right? You have governments can organize and send massive amounts of money to these island nations. And a lot of people think, well, the government should do that. But where do they get that money? They get it by taking it coercively, non-contractually, mandatorily. They mandate it. They oblige people to pay it. They don't give people the option to contribute. They take it. They say, well, we have to have this money. You give it to us because you're our citizens, and we demand it because we're the government. We're starting to get into the idea of taxation, but a lot of it boils down to taxation. A lot of it is what the government's doing here in this particular area might be good, except they're having to fund this through taxation and, or take like certain regulations, right? Take a regulation on an economy, right? Let's say they have, you have a pharmaceutical drug or something like that that's out there. And, there's this vested interest out there that have the FDA approvals and everything in order to produce this drug. And then when we take the there was that AIDS drug a couple years ago, where this one guy came in and he bought up the patent for this drug, this AIDS drug, and then he jacked up the price. And a lot of people are like, oh, this is so terrible. This greedy capitalist is just trying to profit off of people. And yeah, they're right. They're right. But a lot of people are like, well, the government needs to come in and mandate price controls on this. And I'm saying, no, the problem here from an economics perspective is that he doesn't have any competition. If he had competition, somebody else would be producing that drug, and then it would drive the price down. Well, the problem is, the reason why he doesn't have competition is because the FDA says in order to sell a drug, you have to get approvals from the FDA. And guess what happens if you sell a drug in this country that is not approved by the FDA? You have SWAT teams raid your house. Right? That's what happens. Drug prohibition is a complicated subject. But it's one that, at least on a certain level, is a masqueraded problem where they will act like it's this desire to protect people from harmful things, and or this desire to protect people from their neighbor doing these harmful things. But at least a certain percentage of it is due to protecting vested interests in the pharmaceutical industry, because they don't want to compete. But if you go out and you produce some drug to compete with this other drug, if you had gone out, let's say you went and you bought a few pills of that drug and you reverse engineered what it was and you produced your own version of it, you would have been attacked with the sword, right? And it's all in the name, supposedly, of protecting people from harmful drugs, right? I mean, we don't want somebody putting rat poison in a pill and calling it a healthy drug, and people eating that, right? And so the FDA is like, well, we have to protect you from that, and so you have to get approvals. Well, that's a whole digression, right? But the point being, their means of trying to protect people from that is to use the sword against people who aren't putting rat poison in drugs, right? They just use the sword against everybody, right? And so when you think about it, even just voluntarily, even just coordinating, aid efforts for people in Florida who are trying to rebuild, or people in Texas or people on Barbuda who are trying to rebuild, even all that money comes from money that was taken by the threat of force. Even just trying to regulate an economy, you try to go in and you try to say, this factory can only produce so many toxins per year or something like that. And if they go over that, what happens? They fine them. If they don't pay their fines, or if they continue to, what do? They end up arresting the people who are in charge, and they throw them in jail. They come and they use violence. At some point, every government program breaks down through reduction. And sometimes you have to go through various levels, but every government program breaks down through reduction to a point where there is a sword. Actually, a gun nowadays, but essentially the same thing. There's a sword. There's a threat of force there. And so the question is, given that that is the nature of government, that is what government is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends on what they're using the sword for, right? God has given them the sword. Don't get me wrong. God has given government the sword. So what are they to be using it for? They're to be using it for punishing wrongdoers. Period. Now, how are we to understand wrongdoer? This might be something we can get into at some point. And this is where we start to get into that can of worms. That I was talking about covenant theology, not new covenant theology. Because there's several different perspectives on this. And I argue for a perspective that says wrongdoer here is to be interpreted as somebody who has done harm to a victim. Because I see that pattern in Scripture. First of all, there's a logical... Well, no, first of all, in this term, all right, this term here, wrongdoer, is a Greek phrase, actually, of a couple different words. And let me see quick here. I'm going to pull it up in my lexicon here. I am not like your Greek scholar. I didn't go to seminary or anything like that. So by all means, if my handling of Greek is inaccurate, I try to refer to people who know Greek better than me before I go talking about Greek. So by all means, don't like bank too hard on this. And I'm not going to bank too hard on this. I'm not making a huge point out of this. But look at it here though, right? The phrase here is basically to. Kekon prasunti, and I know my pronunciation is very evil. It was very wrong, right? But kekon is basically just a generic word meaning evil, right? But prasunti is probably the key word at this point. Prasunti it means doing, right? It's an action to do, right? But here it is actually, in this particular case, it is like a present active participle, right? So it's an actual commission. It's an active commission of something evil, right? So first of all, we would say that here we have a restraint that the government is only to use the sword against those who are actively doing something evil. So right there you have a distinction between that and somebody who is passively failing to do something good, right? They don't have the authority to compel people to do something good. They only have the authority to punish people who are actively doing something evil, right? So he's not a terror to good conduct. Good conduct here, then, I would have to interpret as anything else, right? Good conduct, again, we're interpreting it within the context of this civil government context, right? So I don't believe that we are talking about the full scope of all morality. We're not talking about the government being an enforcer of all right and wrong in terms of worshiping God with a right heart, having the right attitudes towards your neighbors, living fully holy and godly lives. They're not given the authority to coerce people to do that. They are given the authority to punish people who do outright evil things. And in the context of a civil nation, that would be things that cause harm to other people in the nation, right? So we have victims, right? And then, I'll admit that just directly hearing this text, that word is a little unclear. This text in and of itself is slightly unclear. I think, really, because of the phrasing of that word, and because of the fact that we're in the context of Romans 12, where he talks about not avenging ourselves. And then he compares the avenger then to, Romans 13 says the government's the avenger. So we're talking in this context here of conflict between people, right? We have persecutors, people who are coming and doing us harm, right? We are not to avenge ourselves. He's the avenger, right? So we're in that context, right? And then also we have a logical distinction here, right? Obviously, at some point you have to recognize there is a difference, just a logical, real difference between a sin that is just a sin and a sin that actually causes harm to someone's person or property, right? I mean, I can go do some really sinful thing and not cause harm to my neighbor. And by harm, I mean, like, actually hurt him, right? I might... So some people would say, well, you're causing harm because you're contributing to the moral degradation of society or something like that. And we'll get into those kinds of objections later. But I don't think I still think that even between that, there's still a distinction between that sort of general harm of moral degradation of society. There's a difference between that and something that actually does harm. Like if I punch my neighbor in the face, I've done him harm. If I go and I spray paint his fence, I've done him harm, right? If I kill his dog, I have done him harm because I've deprived him of property or I have damaged his body in some way. But still, I'll admit that on its face, this passage isn't as clear as maybe I would like it to be. And so we have to say, this is where I have to say, okay, I am sort of imposing a definition on this text. I'll admit that. I am sort of imposing a definition on this text. So the question is, where do I get that definition? I get that definition from systematic theology. And this is why we get into a can of worms. Because what systematic theology you subscribe to may or may not come to bear here. Like, for example, the theonomist systematic theology would say, well, this has to be every law that God prescribed through Moses. Right? The abiding validity of the law in exhaustive detail, right? So obviously the ceremonial laws are no longer enforced because Jesus fulfilled that, is what they would say. But other than that, everything. So homosexuals should be executed, adulterers should be executed, et cetera, et cetera. That would be the faithful Bonsonite theon. I know there's degrees of theonomy, right? But the faithful Bonsonite theonomy would be, we have to enforce the Mosaic law was given. This is the law that God says all civil governments should enforce, and so here we go. Let's just follow the Mosaic law. I don't subscribe to that. I don't subscribe to a Presbyterian covenant theology. I subscribe to a Baptist covenant theology, but then you get into Baptist covenant theology versus New Covenant theology, and there's a lot of disagreement there. But I think I really don't think that my interpretation here really depends on which version of covenant theology versus New Covenant theology you subscribe to. I think as long as you're not interpreting things the way theonomists interpret things, I think that it falls into my court, really. Because I again go back to the Noahic covenant in Genesis 9, where he says in Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image, right? So right there you have the seed foundational principle of this civil government, civil justice idea, right? Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood will be shed, right? So there's a logical either or there. You are either, well, there's really only three categories you're in here. You are either not shedding blood, or you are shedding blood justly, or shedding blood unjustly. Right? You are not shedding. If you're not shedding blood, good for you. If you are shedding blood where no blood has been shed, then you are shedding blood unjustly. If you are shedding blood where blood has been shed, you are shedding blood justly. Right? Those are the only three categories we see here. Now, I would say, because of principles fleshed out later, self-defense is acceptable, right? So if your blood is about to be shed, or if somebody's blood is about to be shed, and you defend them, then that's different. That falls under the category of the person about to shed the blood is essentially shedding the blood because they're like in the act, and you're defending the person. That's acceptable. But still, the idea is the violence is only ever to be used. The sword is only ever to be used in response to the use of the sword as a defensive or a retaliatory, retributive measure. Right? You go to Exodus. Go to Exodus 21, where you have the case laws of in Israel about how somebody kills somebody, their life is forfeit. If whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. Right? They have whoever strikes his father and mother or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in his possession shall be put to death. This idea that when you do harm to somebody, harm should come to you, and it's summarized in verse 23. If there's harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. This is called lex talionis. The law of, I'm not exactly sure what that Latin word talionis really means, but it's the idea that punishment should fit the crime, right? And when there's a crime is defined as when you've done harm to somebody, and the punishment should be the equivalent to the harm that you inflict. If you kill somebody, your life is forfeit. If you steal from somebody, you pay the money back you stole, and then you pay them a little extra to compensate them for having lost what you stole for the time being. That is the principle of justice here that we see. Now, again, I've just appealed to the Mosaic Law. So then, what do we do with that Mosaic Law? Right? Is that Mosaic Law still in force? You've got the varying. You've got the traditional Presbyterian covenant theology. You've got the theonomist covenant theology. You've got the Baptist covenant theology. You've got the New Covenant theology, and they all kind of say different things about whether the Mosaic Law is enforced. But I think it doesn't matter, because you have this idea of general equity. Whether or not the specifics are still in force, whether or not the punishments or the specific laws, you still pretty much throughout church history, there's the consensus on this idea of general equity, that the general equity is still in force. Whether or not the law is still valid as a specific law or not, at the very least, the general equity is still valid. And we have a general equity here, as in an understanding that the general equity understanding of this is that lex talionis basic principle, that crime is defined as when you harm somebody, and the just punishment is that you be harmed in a degree equivalent to the harm that you cause. So really, we could get into New Covenant theology or Covenant theology. For the time being, I really actually haven't solidified my position on that. I kind of see it similarly to how I see eschatology. I haven't really solidified a position on eschatology. I personally lean towards amillennialism, and I personally lean towards Baptist covenant theology. But I don't think it matters at this point. It really doesn't matter at this point. Because the general equity, I think, is the same no matter what. The general equity is, the categories that God thinks in, is that there is this principle, a general equity principle from the Noahic covenant that when you harm somebody, you deserve to be harmed, and that's the purpose that God has given the sword to a governing authority for, to carry out that punishment. And anything else they do with that sword, apart from actually using it to carry out that justice, anything else they do is an abuse of that sword. Now, I think, up to this point, I think most people would say they agree with me, except for outright statists. I think most people who have really read and thought through this passage, including the people I've been debating lately, would say they agree with me on this. It's just the implication of what that means, then, where we digress. And I would, at this point, say that, at the very least, I've proven a minarchist state, quote-unquote night watchman minarchy, where all that the government does is this role of criminal justice, that their taxation is only authorized for the purpose of funding this particular operation, that no other taxation is authorized here. And if that's the most I can prove from this, I'll be very happy with that. Because we have, if we had that situation in our government where that was what we had, a true sort of Ron Paul night watchman minarchy, I'd be very happy with that. That'd be so much better than what we have now, in so many ways. But that's not what we have. And I'm still going to argue for a further logical progression that leads us to anarcho-capitalism. Because I think still, even though taxation here may, I'm not taking a position one way or other at this point, may be authorized for the purpose of funding this, I still think it's better for an AnCap system, and for ways I'm gonna explain as I get into this. But I'll admit that the reasoning for that is a little more nuanced. Is not directly crystal clear in Romans 13. So I can't say Romans 13 is like the Romans 9 of this debate, right? Unfortunately, a lot of opponents of libertarianism, of Reformed libertarianism, seem to think that Romans 13 is like that. Seem to think that, they just throw Romans 13 at us, and they're like, see, Romans 13 says, blah, and so you can't be a libertarian. And I go, well, no. I just had an exchange with somebody on Facebook a couple weeks ago, or last week or whatever, where they were speaking against Calvinism. And they literally said some of the exact same things that Paul rejects and rebuts in Romans 9. And I was looking at that, and I read their comment, and I thought, I could write a rebuttal to this, but it's so much easier. I'm just going to copy and paste from Romans 9 and paste it in there, because it is literally directly relevant to what they're saying. It's the exact objection that they made was right there. Is there injustice on God's part? Doesn't he give us a choice? Who can resist his will? That's exactly the argument they made. And Paul directly addresses that, right? And he clearly breaks it down logically. Romans 13 doesn't do that really either way for us here. And so I want to, at this point, say, let's have a broad tent here of acceptance and agreement on, at the very most, what is authorized here is night watchmen. That the government here exists to punish outright, external, active doing of evil in the context of civil society, which means they're harming victims. And that is all they're to be doing, right? And you can say, well, what about national defense? Well, national defense is just an extension of the same principle. You just have criminals from outside the country coming in to do harm to criminals, to do harm to victims inside the country. Really, that's just an extension of the same principle. So as long as we keep that understanding tied to it, then I'm fine with national defense in the sense that, whatever, right? National defense absolutely does not mean going over and starting wars in Iraq and Iran and Syria and Afghanistan and wherever else, North Korea, that is not national defense. But it's a bit of a digression there. The point being, let's have a broad tent at this point. I think we can have agreement. I think I have agreement with this friend I've been debating on everything I've talked about so far. Our preference for anarcho-capitalism is simply just a logical deduction that says, well, we think that it would be better. It would be the best way to have a government that fulfills this role without committing injustice itself, and a little bit of pragmatic reasoning, but it's a pragmatic reasoning that's on top of this principled reasoning. But so we have the principled reasoning that says we think that it would be better for them to fulfill this role without violating the principles themselves. And let's add some pragmatic reasoning here from economics that says, by the way, a market would actually give them incentives to incentives to do it right and to do it well, and would punish them when they do it wrong. Whereas right now we have a society where government is the arbiter in disputes to which they are a party, and they have no incentive to actually do it right or to do it well. And so we're sort of stuck in the system where they're supposed to be good, but they're not. And so, we as anarcho-capitalists would say, well, it would be better if we had a society where that was not the case. Let's have a market society. And the only thing left to say at this point, and I'll probably have to revisit this point, and maybe I'll lead off with this next time, is that, a couple hundred years ago, this discussion, we would have to be having it in a vacuum, right? We would have to be having it as a completely theoretical thing, right? We would be saying, well, what if the government was, and it's like, what does it matter? The king says pay your taxes. The king is the king. What are you going to do about it, right? You got to obey the king. You got to, 1,200 years ago, 1,800 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, living under Nero. Imagine having this discussion, right? We could say Nero is unjust because he is using the sword in ways that is not right, right? He is using the sword to do things that he is not authorized to do. He is unjust. All right, great. Now what do we do with that? I don't know. But now we can actually do something with that. And I think we ought to do something with that. And that is why I am so intent on communicating these things. Because we have the ability to do something with that. I think we have the responsibility to do something with that. We have the privilege in our nation to participate in our government through voting, through writing your senators, through persuading others to vote and write their senators, to win this battle for ideas so that the public in general thinks about these things the right way and votes the right way and influences their politicians the right way, so that we have a society where our government is run in a just way. So, what are we voting for? What are we advocating when we advocate for political change? That has to be consistent with God's precepts, right? And to sit there and say, well, it says obey the government. That really doesn't get to the idea. That doesn't get to the issue. It says pay your taxes. Okay, that doesn't get to the issue. That doesn't answer the question of whether we should vote for taxation. Right? It doesn't. And so we have to think about these things from that perspective, not just the perspective of I'm a citizen who is under authority, so I have to obey, but we also have to think about it from the perspective that our Constitution says we the people, and our voting process and our democracy sort of puts us also above government. And so in a way, we are the authority over the government. Not in a Marxist sense of we are the government, and not ultimately in a sense to where that means we don't have to follow the law. But we do have a privilege and an opportunity and the right, simply because of the way the country was founded, the right to be an influence for change in these things. And so we have to be an influence for change according to God's principles. And I think in general, most people agree to that, but they sort of disagree on what those principles are and how we ought to vote. And so that's what I'm here to advocate. So I'm going way over time. I try to keep these things in 30 minutes. We're getting close to 50 here. I do apologize for that, but I hope this has been good and enriching, and I hope you stick with me, because I think we're getting somewhere here. I think we're almost done with Romans 13. There's more to say. Maybe next episode, I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to cover first or next in this discussion, but at some point I'm going to start getting to objections. Specifically some of the objections that were raised, because I think they're good things to answer. They're good things to talk about. And so we'll get to that maybe next time, maybe not, maybe the time after. I don't know. We'll see. But for now, I'm Mike Lewis. This has been Truth and Liberty. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe and share and do all that social media stuff. Get this out there. Not because I really want to be famous. It's only because if you've been enriched by this, maybe somebody else will. And if you haven't been enriched by this, then, well, maybe I should fold up and close up shops. And so, I don't know. Let's vote with your like button then, as far as whether this is good or not. So, if you have any feedback on anything at all, especially topics you want me to cover or anything like that, by all means, hit me up. If some of you know where to find me on Facebook, you can comment on the Facebook page. You can comment on YouTube. You can do anything you want, right? I don't currently have a Twitter handle, and I'm not on Instagram or any of that stuff. But who knows? We're starting small, but maybe we'll pick up some steam. So, thank you very much. I hope you guys have a good time. Thanks.